At 2 in the morning on June 6, 1944, German radar operators stationed along the northern coast of France picked up the first signals from 3 separate Allied invasion fleets. The events of the next 24 hours would be forever afterward known to history as D-Day. For the Germans, the 3 fleets were something of a surprise. The largest was more or less as they had expected. It was heading toward Boulogne-sur-Mer, a port town located about 15 miles southwest of Calais. The English Channel was at its narrowest there, and the large buildups of Allied tanks and equipment in England's southwest county of Kent had been photographed many times by German reconnaissance planes. If the landings near Calais were to succeed, it would put the Allies in control of a port, which would enable them to bring in large numbers of troops and tanks in the weeks that followed. The second large invasion fleet was headed toward Cap d'Antifer. This was something of a surprise, but it made sense. That town was just north of the critically important port at Le Havre. Perhaps the Allied plan was to divide their attack and thereby split the German defenses. If one of the landings succeeded, with a port in hand, the Allies could bring in more men and materiel in a second wave. From the radar reports, the Germans could make out that the third and smallest of the 3 fleets was heading toward Normandy. That made no sense because there was no port there. Any forces landing couldn't be resupplied. Also, without a port, it would be impossible to bring ashore any additional waves of heavy equipment or tanks. After careful consideration, the German High Command realized that the smallest of the 3 invasion fleets had to be a diversion. The radar operators watched their screens and worked out that the 3 fleets were steadily advancing toward the shore at an average speed of about 8 knots. Based on that, the first of the 3 fleets, the smallest one at Normandy, would arrive just after dawn. The other 2 would arrive around noon. It seemed that the Allied commanders were hoping to draw off German reserves to Normandy so that the main landings would be unopposed. The Germans felt confident in their ability to defeat any Allied invasion right at the beaches. Over the past 2 years, they had built the Atlantic Wall, a massive defense work of gun emplacements, pillboxes, and concrete walls topped with trenches that would slow the invasion down long enough for Germany's tanks, its panzer divisions, to deploy from inland and fight back the landings at the beach. The idea was that the tanks could easily crush the Allied forces before they could establish a beachhead. The Germans recognized that the Allied plan was both cunning and crafty. If they fell for the Allied deception and deployed their panzers, they could easily achieve a victory at Normandy. However, the other 2 landings would be unopposed and would succeed. The Germans decided to defend at both of the key ports, keeping a strong reserve just in case the Allies had a breakout. As for Normandy, they would ignore the diversion for now, and only destroy it later after they had defended the 2 ports successfully. The German radar operators were also tracking extensive Allied air cover flying over all 3 fleets. These were undoubtedly British and American night fighters ordered to defend against any Luftwaffe attack while they were at sea and most vulnerable. By dawn, the German High Command realized that Allied fighters and bombers would take off and attack German positions at each landing zone. As well, given Allied air superiority, there was little chance of attacking the 3 invasion fleets from the air. Exactly as the German radar operators had predicted, the Allied landings began at Normandy. Early reports from the Atlantic Wall seemed encouraging. The Allies were having a difficult time getting ashore. Casualties were extensive. The German defenses were holding. The bigger question was whether they could hold against the 2 larger invasion fleets at Calais and Le Havre. They looked out across the waves through binoculars, hoping to get their first sight of the 2 largest invasion fleets. What they saw in the far distance, however, was that aircraft were flying back and forth in front of the 2 fleets, laying down thick smoke screens. By mid-morning, the picture of what was happening was confused. Communications lines had been cut, and air attacks were taking place all across northern France. There were reports of paratroopers landing overnight from Normandy to Calais. While the fighting seemed most intense at Normandy, the German tank divisions were held at Calais to defend against the 2 larger fleets that could still be seen approaching on radar. Just before noon, the swarms of aircraft that had been laying down smoke screens suddenly turned north and flew toward England. In the minutes that followed, the Germans stared as the smoke dissipated, hoping for a first glimpse of the Allied fleets. Instead, all they saw was empty sea. The German radar operators were equally shocked. The fleets that they had been watching on their screens had grown fainter and thinner and then had disappeared almost entirely. At Boulogne-sur-Mer, the radar showed what looked like 8 small boats heading north. At Cap d'Antifer, the number was just 6. Bizarrely, observers could see that each of the small boats had a mid-sized anti-aircraft blimp lashed down on the decks, tethered at the stern. Both fleets had somehow vanished, as if into thin air. It seemed impossible, but the only invasion on D-Day was the one that had taken place at dawn in Normandy, the one the Germans had thought was a diversion. How had the Allies done it? They had magically created 2 huge invasion fleets in the English Channel. Then they'd magically made them disappear. What had happened is the Germans had been misled by a series of carefully crafted deception campaigns. To create the disappearing fleets, 3 different operations had been devised. The first was Operation Moonshine. It involved blimp-mounted radio repeaters that received German radar signals, amplified them, and then rebroadcast them back to the shore. The blimps were mounted on a set of fast boats that reeled them up into the air, turned on the electronics, and then slowly made their way across the English Channel in a wide horizontal line. Between Kent and Calais, Operation Glimmer had tasked entire squadrons of Stirling and Lancaster bombers from RAF Bomber Command to fly at 3,000 feet over the water. They flew back and forth as the crews threw out bundles of window, which were long strips of paper coated with aluminum that reflected radar. Over the 11 months prior to D-Day, during night missions over Germany, window had been used to block the German radar networks that guided the Luftwaffe's night fighters onto individual bombers. Instead of seeing individual airplanes on their radar screens, the German operators saw only wide, brightly lit areas that obscured everything. By dropping window down low over the water, combined with the radar repeaters in Operation Moonshine, the RAF Bomber Command had tricked the radar operators along the coasts to thinking that the signals they were seeing were a massive invasion fleet heading toward the coast of France. It was one of the greatest deception campaigns in history, part of a much larger operation known as Fortitude South. At Boulogne-sur-Mer, just 8 small boats with moonshine gear were used for the radar repeaters. In Operation Taxable at Cap d'Antifer, just 6 boats were used. Hundreds of planes had flown hours and hours at low altitude. The confused flight crews complained bitterly at having to drop handfuls of window, only to watch it pointlessly disappear into the waves. To the flight crews, the mission made no sense whatsoever. They had hoped to support the landings on D-Day. Instead, they flew all night, back and forth, returning to refuel and fly again in the morning. Reports of the landings that were underway spoke of large fleets of ships, but from their perspective, they were pointlessly throwing bundles of window out into the sea, wasting thousands of gallons of costly aviation fuel. What they didn't understand was that the strips of window that they were dropping was the key to the ultimate deception. The carefully timed legs they were flying, throwing bundle after bundle of window out the bottom of the airplane, was mimicking an entire invasion fleet on German radars. So many planes were used that the strips of window made a continuous reflection. The spacing in between each plane ensured there were no gaps. The planes had to arrive at staggered intervals, fly their exact routes and orbits on a set schedule, and then return only when the next plane arrived to take their place, all in perfect sequence. If a plane or two was late, gaps would develop in the radar signature, and the Germans might recognize that the invasion fleet wasn't real. To expect such precise timing, however, was absurd. There would be delays in takeoffs. Some planes would arrive early. To make it work, the planners simply scheduled far more planes than necessary to complete the task. There would be enough overlap to ensure that there was never a gap. When the flight crews were briefed, they assumed that they were providing a radar reflection screen for an advancing invasion fleet. But in the pre-dawn hours before D-Day, as they flew south to start their assigned treks, all they saw was empty sea. One pilot, Squadron Leader Dave Shannon, an Australian and one of the famed dam busters of RAF 617 Squadron, described his mission on D-Day like this. involved the hazardous task of flying straight and level at 3,000 feet in bright moonlight, dropping window at the same time. Bloody browned off. As it happened, one of the most important bomber missions of the entire war hadn't even dropped a single bomb. There's an old saying in diplomacy that perception is more important than reality. With Operations Glimmer, Taxable, and Moonshine, it proves something else. At least when it comes to military operations, deception is more important than reality. I'm Thomas Van Hare, and this is Historic Wings. Please share, give me a like, subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Sponsoring us on Patreon or PayPal will help us expand and produce more videos. And remember, there's always more to the story.